of Gender Studies. And this panel has been curated by my colleague SM Rodriguez, as well as facilitated very brilliantly by Violent Fox. So thank you very much for this work as well. Our four guests today, special guests today, are Dr. Chloe Alexander. Chloe has completed her master's in gender and social policy, a precursor to gender policy and inequalities, in 2010. And currently, Chloe is a research fellow at the Health Services Management Center at the University of Birmingham, and part of the ESRC Center for Care. Chloe's research centers on care inequalities, through the study of childhood, family studies, family life, and policy. And the particular focus of Chloe's research is spotlighting the situation of young carers, so children as carers, and their life trajectories there. Our second speaker is Dr. Carolina Alonso Bejarano, who has graduated, welcome Carolina, who has graduated from the department with an MSc in Gender and Social Policy in 2010. And Carolina is a lawyer. Carolina is teaching law at the University of Warwick and researching immigrants' rights movement and reproductive justice. Carolina's research intersects with activism and intersects with art as well, through various forms, including DJing and cartooning. And as a DJ and as a cartoonist and as a researcher, Carolina has worked on intersections of these different forms of research and activism. And a recent example of this work is a book published by Duke University Press titled Decolonizing Ethnography, Undocumented Immigrants and New Directions in Social Science. And this has been both written and co-produced with collaborators in the field with women community organizers in New Jersey. So welcome, Carolina. Our third speaker will be Dr. Cynthia Citlallin Delgado, who has completed an MSc in Gender in 2015, so a little bit more recent history. And Cynthia is an assistant professor of gender and sexuality in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at Pace University in New York City. Cynthia works on critical theory, on queer and trans studies, on feminist theory, and on critical geographies in Latin American studies. And one example of Cynthia's recent work, or current project as well, is Staging the Interstice, proposes a queer theory of space, drawing on contemporary transfeminist artists and activists in Mexico City. And finally, our fourth speaker today is Professor Elisabeth Lund Engebretsen, who has an MSc in Gender received in 2000. So welcome back, Elisabeth. Elisabeth is Professor of Gender Research at the Center for Gender Studies at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And there in Norway, Elisabeth also directs the Norwegian Queer Research Group, as well as a research group on populism, anti-gender, and democracy. And one recent example of work is the current work on feminist activism in China, which follows other work like Transforming Identities in Contemporary Europe, an edited collection of essays published by Routledge. So the order of today's panel event would be that the speakers will speak to their current areas of research for about 15 minutes each. I would ask audience who are online who are not speaking to remain muted. After the panel has presented their research, we will open the discussion to a round of questions. So thank you very much for attending. And please, could we start with you, Chloe, telling us a little bit about your current work?
Great. Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be back. I hope the connection's okay. I don't know if I'm getting a bit juddery. So I've been very excited about this event. It's a real lovely opportunity to connect with gender at LSE and the Gender Institute, as I kind of still hold it in my head. I'll talk to you about my research on young carers mainly, but I'll just kind of put it in context and explain how it developed. So as Ania introduced, I did an MSc in Gender and Social Policy in 2010, and was very inspired and excited by what I'd learned, and felt this kind of that the next step for me was I wanted to work on policy issues and campaigning. So I started kind of moving into different roles, different jobs in the third sector in charities. So I worked on gender inequalities, mental health, childcare, and also on adult social care and carer issues, so unpaid carers and informal carers. So that was work I did for about 6 years. But I felt a kind of frustration that I wasn't able to question things. I wasn't able to provoke discussion as much as I'd kind of really enjoyed and held on to in my studies at the LSE. So I put together a proposal for a PhD that would look at intersectional inequalities and children's role as young carers in the UK. And I was able to start doing a PhD at the University of Birmingham, focusing on young carers and inequalities and kind of shaping up what I wanted to do. I started that in 2016, and that did kind of build on what I'd learned at LSE Gender. So I felt really fired up about research on care, and I did my PhD research, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And that kind of led to working at the ESRC Centre for Care, that's led by the University of Sheffield. And I'm based at the Health Services Management Centre at the University of Birmingham. And through those two kind of connections, I feel like I'm able to be part of quite wide-ranging discussions about care, but maintain this kind of real interest in young carers. And also to think about the kind of strengths and weaknesses of what collective provision there is for care, what public services there are, the extent to which those are legitimised and responded to and valued. But my research focuses on this group of children who are part of care work, but maybe one that's kind of not recognised always, isn't really given space and attention. So well, I talk about young carers, and that's quite a kind of UK-based term. There are kind of different kind of global perspectives on how you talk about children's role in care work. But typically they'll be looking after a family member, maybe a parent or a sibling, and that person might have a disability, mental health needs, or other reasons, other kind of ways of locating that care in that person and seeing what they need and that they need a response. And if in the UK a child is called a young carer, they might be offered specialist support, but not always. And when I talk about young carers, it might be that you recognise yourself, that you know of or were, encountered in your childhood young people who cared for a family member. It might not have been something that was really labelled in that way or recognised, but it's kind of very common, or it might be something you relate to yourself. Children's role in care work can be quite unacknowledged, so professionals might be aware of it, or they might be unaware of it and not really kind of accept it as something that's happening. They might see it there but turn away from it, or it might be something that's kind of present and asserts itself in certain conversations but isn't really dealt with or reacted to. So there's this kind of curiosity I have about it, about the ways it is kind of so kind of hidden, so layered, so pushed to the side. It can be a very difficult thing for children and young people, and that's something I've kind of explored in my work, that children can be doing many hours of care, per week or per day even. These tasks can be quite difficult, so they might be kind of labelled as something that a child isn't appropriate for them to do. It might be things like they might be budgeting for the family, they might be caring for their siblings, they might be dealing with medication, they might be lifting people, and they might have to be kind of quite vigilant and quite like heavily responsible for the family and how well they can kind of sustain themselves. It also can be a big source of pride for children and young people. So children can really value the care work they're part of. And there can be quite a lot of efforts. People build these communities of young carers to support one another and find a lot of kind of recognition from their peers sometimes. So whilst it's something that can be condemned and criticized or kind of labeled as a problem, it also can be something that people really hold on to and are very kind of loyal to, and it matters a lot to them. It has, you know, a lot of importance in people's personal lives. So that's just introducing the topic I work on, and why I come back to it again and again, because I think it's so interesting the way that it's there, it's present, but so often so ignored. And when I've been thinking about my research and how I want to approach the topic, I've kind of developed different methodological tools and approaches. For my PhD, I really thought about kind of the relationality of those children and their care. So it's very embedded in their relationships, and often research locates this kind of individual child, this young carer, but actually they're really connected to other people. Understanding their position, their activities, their feelings is very much about their relationships and how care is woven through those family relationships and goes beyond the family as well. So relationality is kind of really important in my methodological approach, but also the kind of ethical questions that come up in my research. Because in that relationality, I'm finding out about very, you know, quite stark power differences sometimes in the relationships that I'm kind of interacting with, or when I'm approaching people and asking them to be part of research. So I've carried out participant observation studies, and ethnographic methods have been important to me. So doing observations of families, learning about them, spending time with them, kind of building my kind of connections to them as well. And then also participatory methods, so how the people that I'm doing research with can shape what I do and direct it or have a say and make it their own kind of project as well as mine. And I've tried to bring a bit of creativity in my research. Sometimes I feel like I'm pushing myself quite a bit out of my comfort zone, but it's been really rewarding. So thinking about visual ethnographic methods, drawing. So for example, asking my the families I was with, the children and the parents, to draw how they would care for their family in space. Thinking about these alternative futures of care, imagining changes, imagining continuities, the things that they would want to sustain and protect, the things that they would leave far behind if they could. So trying to bring those kind of possibilities and that idea of the future to their research, to my research, and to their kind of role in it. And I've also thought about my own kind of connection to the research and its meaning to me and its connection to my own life. So some of my motivation certainly comes from the experience I had as a child. My sister is deaf and was kind of positioned and kind of described as this disabled person. I was seen to be connected to her and providing support to her. But when I thought about that in relation to the topic and what the potential was for doing research on it and finding new perspectives, I was drawing on this problem I had with the way young carers were characterized, that didn't really recognize the many privileges that people were bringing, the many resources people were drawing on to shape and limit or expand a young carer position in a family. So in my own experience, the kind of economic resources we had, the social capital, we kind of asserted an idea of like a social model of disability. We learned from other disabled communities and other deaf people. We built these kind of connections, and that kind of changed the way I saw myself and the way we saw my sister. So I think that was part of what shaped my PhD research in a way, was thinking about the inequalities and the privileges that people bring to these young carer roles, rather than these kind of homogenous positions that children are put in, and then care is just a natural fact that comes from a disabled person being present, and how reductive that is, how kind of essentializing. But there's also these tensions in those reflections I have, and a lot of discomfort I have about bringing myself and thinking about my own position in the research and how that kind of motivates me. So there's this kind of way I often try and feel like I'm kind of turning the volume down on my own reflections and my own position in the research and that discomfort I have with it, and seeing how I can push myself to think about that critically and kind of make that more present and account for it. And I think something I've learned from that as well is that the discomfort I feel about representing myself in the research is partly because of the relationships I have, that by defining myself, I'm also defining the person I am connected to with this care relationship, and the feeling that I'm potentially misrepresenting them and speaking without their permission or without their kind of authorization, or not respecting their kind of different perspective. So I think in some ways I've learned from that and that tension about how I'm connected to in my personal life, those connections, those relationships, how discomforting that is to then define yourself as an individual. So I think in some ways it has shaped my research a lot, and my methods and the kind of ethical questions that I've kind of posed. So the research I did for my PhD, the participant observation, the visual methods, I was trying to get to the intersecting inequalities that create differences for children as young carers within families, but also between them. And within families, I was looking at the intersections between particularly gender, age, and disability in defining certain people as the ones providing care and defining others as the people that receive care. And maybe disregarding the care work done particularly by disabled people, seeing them as, you know, they're these binaries that they must be receiving care rather than providing it. And also the kind of confusion that comes from seeing a young person, a child, defined as this active caring subject. Maybe that's part of the kind of story of the ways they're ignored and made invisible. But also the inequalities in the ways that these policies are defining families and defining children as young carers, and are kind of propelling certain families into relationships with services, some that are more forceful than others. So families that are Black or minority ethnic families, or have a kind of a contested like citizenship status, seem to, with the families that I was working with, seem to be under greater pressure to kind of admit these services into their lives, maybe ones that had put them under more pressure, maybe exerted a bit more control, or a bit more of a kind of, there were more kind of sanctions attached to the ways they had to act. Whereas maybe middle class families and white families were given a bit more freedom to set the terms of their engagement with these services. So that was some of the ways I was looking at the kind of intersections between these different inequalities, or these kind of co-constituting inequalities. So I was looking, what I was trying to bring together was a picture of the unequal conditions of care that make it very varied how a child might be defined as a young carer or participate in that kind of practice, but not be labelled in that way. So I was comparing individual circumstances, individual families, but trying to look between them and see the ways that certain privileging positions gave families a bit more freedom in these relationships, and structures were kind of allocating care work to children, but in quite an unaccounted for way. So those were the kind of inequalities that I was kind of trying to piece together with the PhD research that I did a few years ago. And then also I was looking, in terms of policies, I was looking at the ways that policies have kind of effective relations. So policies are kind of creating certain feelings within families. They're changing the capacities different families have. So I was looking at that using kind of affect theory, thinking about the different capacities that are built within certain families, the families that are allowed to feel more supported, to feel more empowered, other families that are seen as more there to be brought into certain services and maybe reformed or reorganized externally. And I found that kind of helpful to think about policies in a new way. Maybe the kind of affects of policy are kind of don't get very much scrutiny. It can be quite an awkward way to think about things, but in some ways it brings policies and family life kind of very intimately close together, rather than seeing them as removed or kind of transmitted through quite kind of cold formal processes. Actually, there's a lot of feeling and a lot of kind of closeness and intimacy in the ways these groupings of people and these kind of instruments are connected. And so I've kind of developed kind of these different methods, a kind of toolkit for thinking about young carers, which draws so much, has such a kind of debt to the learning and the knowledge I received at the Gender Institute, and that kind of motivation to do research in this area. And my research is trying to kind of build this kind of more nuanced account of children in care relationships, but also recognize the kind of diversity of those and the ways that they are not allowed to speak as often as they should, and trying to pinpoint the ways that that can change within families, but also looking at from the policy perspective as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chloe, for keeping to time, but also for this drawing our attention to these issues that we typically do not think in the context of the UK in terms of child carers and the issue of, you know, we think of child labor, or if we think about care and labor, child labor is not something that is at the forefront of our minds. I'd like to now pass the microphone to Cynthia. Cynthia, your 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Ania. Thank you, SM, and thank you, Violet, for putting all of this together. And thank you, everybody that is here with us today. It's always so gratifying to get to return to a place that shaped you, so even if you returned virtually. So I'm very happy to be here in my capacity as alum of LSE. So what I'm going to share with you today, or just a little snippet of, is the work that I'm currently working on, which is my book project that I'm finishing on. So all my attention and energy is going primarily to that. And the book is titled, thus far, Staging the Interstices, Transfeminist Performance and the Disorder of Space. And it looks at performances by contemporary trans and queer artists in Mexico City that take place in interstitial locations, that is in sites that operate neither as fully public nor as fully private. So spaces like the prison patio, the entrance and exit of the prison, the subway, the dressing room in this cabaret / kind of travesti house of transformation, in a rooftop, in an alleyway, and through a window. So I theorize how the interstices through art, but also in the everyday, is differently staged by these artists, and how, and in this way kind of bring together theories of gender and sexuality, specifically contemporary queer and transformations of gender and sexuality, of performance and of space and place. And I guess I should have given a little bit more context, but my PhD ended up being in performance studies, hence why the focus is primarily on transfeminist performance. But anyway, so in this book, what I think about is precisely kind of the interstices through both a theoretical and an artistic and a performance studies lens. There's been this kind of sustained curiosity or preoccupation with this notion of the in-between, of the liminal, right? And it's been kind of tackled through a wide array of disciplines, right? So from like performance studies and their interest in liminality, in ritual and in theater, through the semiotics traditions of like Black feminism and Horton Spiller's idea of the missing word, through border studies in women of color feminisms like Anzaldua's Nepantlism, in urban studies through thinking of like Terra and Vague and all of these spaces that are left over in the city, and of course, not least from queer and trans studies, especially thinking through that notion of the prefix of trans, right, which is both foundational to trans studies, but also highly contested in so many ways. So kind of stemming from this rich scholarship that's been labored on since at least the late 60s and 70s, staging the interstices kind of brings together these theoretical streams in order to offer yet another approach to this in-between by way of using performance and like the performance thinking of staging as a method in some ways in order to approach the interstices. I conceive of the interstices as this kind of punctual in situ space and time, so like an actual place, one that is insurgent, but is still concrete, right? So it's not necessarily permanently in place, but it can be, and it often is, but it kind of becomes the space that you enter into, or that can be belabored. So it's in some ways, it's not just that the interstices and the in-between is something that is negotiated, although it always is, but I argue that it's also something that is crafted, and therefore it can be recrafted and kind of made again through performance. And in some ways that gives us insight into like a different way of ordering or thinking about space. So What's fun about this project for me? Well, many things are fun about this project for me, but one of them is kind of the way I've organized it or I've put it together. Methodologically speaking, I use kind of what performance studies allows me to do in some ways is play with a lot of different methods and a lot of different objects to think with. So I use a lot of ephemera, I use interviews, I use images of artwork, I use site visits, etc., and kind of bring all of these things together through music, film, etc. But what I really enjoy as well is putting it together is the way that I've kind of organized it or put it together as this story or journey through Mexico City. So what happens is that each chapter focuses on the work of one artist alongside the interstices through which they belabor or in which they intervene, and then kind of theorizes at least one aesthetic recourse or one concept throughout that chapter, even though it draws on many of them. So I think one of the more beautiful things about this project is, oh, I wanted to, is there any way I could share screen? Because I think one of the things I like to share with for this project is precisely some of the images. So just like a brief, it's not allowing me to share screen. So I'm wondering if, thank you. 1 second, if I can find it. All right, can everybody see my screen now? Yes, great. So just like as a brief thing, kind of what each chapter goes through, because the order again kind of traces this journey throughout the city. So the first chapter looks at the work of La Bruja de Texcoco, who is featured here. She's this performer and trans musician, and I think of her work and her first album primarily, but more than her first album, I think about her story of becoming, so that I think through myth and through the interstices that is print, right? So I kind of take her story of becoming a witch, of becoming a woman, and of becoming an artist that kind of intertwined together, was featured in this tabloid newspaper in Mexico City that kind of runs through the veins of the city via its streets and its subways, right? And she was kind of placed right in between two images of violence. So I look about, like there was a narco-related, like very explicit image of death, and then a sex worker solicitation advertisement. And so in an interview with her, she points towards that and kind of being in this in-between, this kind of dialectic of death and sex. And so I think about her myth and becoming myth and how it's intertwined with both the city and gender through this interstice that moves through the veins of the city. The second chapter looks at the work of Lia Garcia, and it theorizes and thinks like tenderness and touch through her own work as not only as a trans woman, but also as an activist and pedagogue that is very much invested in trans feminist actions. And so the space and the interstices that this chapter looks at is the space of the prison, specifically the prison patio, but also how she enters and exits the prison as a woman who's changed her papers legally through her gender, but who's actually free in context, you know, and I put this in quotations, right? Free as opposed to the folks that she works with. And in this project, she stages a quinceañera party within the prison for a group of prisoners that she works with. So the interstices is like this prison space, and we're thinking with touch alongside her. So that's in the north of the city. I kind of then return to the center of the city and then go into a space that is much more enclosed. And I think about this site called Casa Club Rochelle. This is a still image. What you're seeing on the screen is a still image from a film called, it's a homonymous film. It's called Casa Rochelle, and it's directed by Camila José Donoso, but it features this kind of trans fiction, both fact and fiction, a story of a location, a real location in Mexico City, which is a house of transformation that exists and works both as an activist space, but also as a cabaret and as a ludic space for travesti women, primarily older women, but everybody's welcome, or travesti folks that might have to keep their sexual disclosure somewhere safe. So it thinks about not only the space itself and what it occupies in the subcultural imaginary of the city, but rather also kind of tries to think about the displacement of the closet and think thinking about the dressing room. So that's kind of thinking about sexual knowledge and thinking about the dressing room and the gestures of getting ready through this space. We then kind of exit the interior space and onto a rooftop. And I think through the view from above, or this idea of like the density of a city, to think about embodied performances on a rooftop, specifically in a very dense in the easternmost part of the city. So I'll talk a little bit more about this one in a second. And then finally, it kind of takes us into confinement. So this is maybe a journey through also time and in my times during my studies and how it's come together. But this last chapter looks at the alleyway and these photographs, a series of vernacular photographs that were taken by Luisa Almaguer, who is a trans musician and radio host. And even though I'm not featuring her music in this specific chapter, what I'm thinking with is kind of the gaze and also the way that stillness occupies these liminal spaces also sometimes. So what happens with her own gaze when she's photographing somebody outside of her window within an alleyway and engaging in usually domestic activity, but kind of both outside and not outside because it's an alleyway. So it allows for certain privacy. So I think I can. Oh, well, I won't stop sharing. Sorry. So I thought I'd share that with you, but I also thought I would spend just a few more minutes maybe belaboring one of these interstices a little bit more. And I thought it was appropriate to bring it because this was actually kind of engendered throughout my time at LSE. So I kind of like to tell the story of that I got to LSE for my MSc, kind of wanting to get out of the art world and maybe find a new, I used to be an art teacher before that. And so I wanted to, get into something more policy related or research related in some ways. And that LSE, even though I thought it was going to be the place that would take me to the UN, ended up being the place where I just reaffirmed how much I wanted to write about art. And so this piece, which is the rooftop, which is the fourth chapter that I talked a little bit about, was actually one of the objects that I wrote about in my master's thesis. So it's been really quite personally speaking, a journey to think through this object once again and return and revisit it in such different ways than what began during my MSc time, or my time at LSE specifically. So I just thought it was kind of appropriate and nice to think about it. It also happens to be the thing that I'm currently working on, so it's very much fresh in my mind. So I thought I would just end this with a description, or the way I'm kind of describing this specific performance, because at the end of the day, what my project is about, has been about, and continues to be about, is kind of thinking alongside these performers whom I consider as theorists themselves. And so all the theories that emerge from this is because I encounter their archives, because I encounter their artwork, or because I am in constant conversation with these artists. So I thought I'd give you just a quick description, well, not a quick description, but the way I describe it on paper, just so you get an idea of the performances that I'm thinking with and things. And also this chapter theorizes the view from above and kind of gets to this thinking about the too muchness of the city and how do we actually slow it down. And so part of the argument is that performance might allow us to see things that we don't usually see, but it means that we need to tune into a different rhythm of the city. So without further ado, I'm just going to read you some of the way I describe the piece. The piece is titled Travesías del Deseo Deseante, or Traversions of Desiring Desire. It's 2015 and a day like any other atop this azotea, or rooftop, contoured by cables, antennas, lines of clothing, tinacos. The atmosphere is foggy with that everyday pollution the city bears and forgets it inhabits. The performance begins in and as this quotidianity with two people on the rooftop. But the beginning is quick and a little bit nervous. A barely perceptible instant of anticipatory deliberation, and their movements are purposeful. One of them clicks play on a recording device that they had set up, the other on a cell phone that is connected to an old pair of speakers. Cumbia abruptly changes the tempo of the space, shifting its stillness to a familiar music or grain, a punctuating shaky double beat. Skittish and in a seeming rush, they take off most of their clothes, remaining with nothing but briefs. They draw near each other and begin to dance together. It takes some time, but they appear to ease into each other, to settle into the movement with both precision and seriousness. Both short-haired, these dancers hold hands tightly and seldom remove their gaze from each other. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. It is only during their twirls and turns that the onlooker and the camera might catch a glimpse of their breasts. They dance confidently and with seemingly no hesitation. It is only in the steadiness of their mutual gaze, in that intense concentration, where we might decipher a slight sense of self-consciousness. In other words, they know what they're doing. And I mean this both in the sense of comfort and skill with the dance style, they know how to dance, but also that they know how they are dancing, topless, and where they are dancing on a rooftop. And it's not any rooftop. They're dancing on the rooftop of Mirna Roldan's childhood home in Ciudad Neza, the home where her mother still lives. Mirna Roldan is one of the dancers in this performance, this one over here, with the black hair. She's a queer trans feminist artist based in Mexico City who, at the time of this performance, had an exhibition of her work on display at the Museum Exteresa Arte Actual in the center of Mexico City. Rooftops hold a very specific place in the spatial imaginary of a city like CDMX. For famous Mexican chronicler Carlos Monsiváis, for example, the azotea is one of Mexico's quintessential images, part of the visual terrain of the city's too muchness, that permanent obsession with its own constitutive parts, the multitude. In azoteas, he says, evocations and necessities concentrate. There are chickens and goats. There are clothes hanging to dry under the sun. There are rooms that serve as houses where children grow and comadres crash for a while, the rooms always extending in population, if not in actual size. So, empty as they might appear, rooftops are remarkably dense sites in this spatial imaginary. And so against the urban understanding of density as metric to contain and contend with impossible, uncontrollable, large-scale problems, things like population growth, crowding, and traffic, queer density remains in this minor key and gives time and attention to how urban space is lived. Roldan and Barragan's minor azotea performance takes up this charge. The horizontality of travesias is both material in the shortness of the buildings, which make the possibility of a view from above questionable, and performative, a critique by way of performance, not only of the view from above, but of who has access to it and what it might entail. In other words, the azotea can serve as a reparative allegory to the view from above, while remaining minor, critiquing the logics of scalability by being neither in the heights of the skyscraper nor in the depths of the ground or the subterranean. It is there in the density of every city life. So I just wanted to share that with you to get an idea. They're kind of two snippets. There's a lot that happens in between, but I thought I'd give you kind of the textures of some of the work that I'm thinking with and throughout. And that's it. That's all I wanted to share. Sorry if I took up too long. Apologies. I didn't see the time thing.
This is absolutely fine. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you for bringing more of the themes of theorizing the in-between, the theorization of blending, crossing boundaries, and challenging binaries. So with that kind of building up, I think it's apt to call on Elisabeth to provide us with insights on your current research. Go for it, Elisabeth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ania, and everyone. I hope my sound is okay. Great. Yes. I can only echo my co-panelists really to say thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor. And also congratulations to the department, 30 years, that's amazing. And wonderful, and really an inspiration to everyone else, like those of us sitting in smaller departments or centers or institutes around Europe and elsewhere. It's really wonderful to see how incredibly vibrant and successful the department is, although of course I know there are some challenges as well. Well, it was hard to really settle on one thing to talk about, but I decided to a little bit like Cynthia, speak to something I'm working on at the moment and trying to finish, and I have a bit of a strict deadline on my back. So I thought I'll share the screen with you just to give you some nice, I hope, images to follow my conversation with you. Let's see here. If I can see the full screen. I can't really see my top. Okay, here we go. So I'm currently focusing on finishing a chapter for an anthology that's coming out later this year or possibly early next year, which is called Queer and Trans Life, Anthropological Futures. And it's coming out on Birmingham Press later on in an anthropology series. And I could say a lot about the connections between very dear comrades and friends in the UK and London area that I've been working with for many years in terms of queer, gender, and anthropology research, some of which is coming out of LSE and my time at the Gender Institute, but that would take a lot of time now, but I can come back to it later if you like. The draft title of the chapter is here, Look to Norway, ? Queering the potentials for coalitional solidarity in building climate just futures. And what I'm trying to do in this chapter is to reflect on what I perceive to be connections between queer justice and climate justice organizing. And I argue that learning more deeply about these intersections is in fact vital for envisioning and building just and sustainable futures. The underlying premise of my argument is not something that is I'm the first to argue really, but inspired by other work as well, is the realization that the unfolding climate crisis is not a natural, but a political issue, and that this can only be solved by attending to pre-existing systems of oppression. So in this, I'm inspired by various strands of scholarship, activist scholarship as well, such as climate justice and environmentalism work, queer and trans theorizing, indigenous feminist and queer scholarship, both in the Nordic region and globally, and all of which is helping us to think more critically and in constructive and generative ways about notions such as care, those of hope, coalition, resilience, vulnerability, alliance and solidarity in building and maintaining movements. So in this chapter, I developed this idea by discussing and analyzing two ongoing indigenous Sami and youth-led climate campaigns against the state in my native country of Norway. So why Norway really, apart from the fact that I'm sort of from there? I would say that Norway holds quite a paradoxical status when it comes to international climate politics. On the one hand, sorry, this is my dog drinking in the background, being an overall well-functioning social democracy, so-called egalitarian society, and extremely wealthy due to a ginormous oil fund that supports its generous welfare and equality policies, Norway is in principle, at least, uniquely positioned to take a global lead in addressing climate change by transitioning to green energy and advocating for just collaborations and interdependence among nations. The reality, however, is that incentives to reduce and end fossil extraction by 2030 and protect the environment are being actively ignored by successive governments, as new fossil extractive projects at sea and land in Norway and also globally are being commissioned. The argument is that Norway produces cleaner and greener energy, that a democracy that produces oil and gas is better than an authoritarian one, and read here Gulf-based or the Middle Eastern with all the kind of racist and colonial connotations that entails. And also that we need to develop rather than eliminate fossil energy production for the sake of global stability. And that this has become very prominent in specifically now in Russia's war in Ukraine, which has destabilized energy exports to continental Europe, and Norway has actually profiteered immensely from the war on this without really wanting to share this money with Ukraine and so on, for example. So the irony here, if we can call it that, is that Norway's wealth and welfare, and indeed the broader Nordic model of quality and welfare, can actually be argued to rely on a capitalist logic of production and consumption that is firmly rooted in heteropatriarchal colonialism. This is, of course, a longer argument. But this logic depends on mentalities of individualism, a particular kind of identity politics and independence, and a strict separation between a human-centered society defined by national borders and their policing, increasingly strict policing, and polarized against nature and various others. Such logic is, of course, in stark contrast to the sustainability and well-being logic of global interdependence that is required to combat climate change. So a recent surge in indigenous Sami and youth-led climate protests against the Norwegian government challenges this dominant logic. And I will just briefly present to you one of those cases here, which is the Fosen campaign. And that is in fact what you're looking at on the screen right now. It's an enormous wind farm in the central parts of Norway in a peninsula called Fosen. It was originally commissioned in 2010, and it's estimated to be the largest land-based wind energy generating farm in Europe. The central problem here is that the Fosen territory is part of indigenous Sami reindeer herding land, and the government is required by national and international law to take such issues into consideration when territories are considered for invasive developments such as this. Sami herders and their allies took the state and the energy company to court. And in 2021, after the case actually made it all the way up to the Norwegian Supreme Court, which few cases do, they actually won, surprisingly enough. However, the court did not instruct the government on what to do next. And so the wind farm continued expanding. Sorry, and I lost my thread here. Continued expanding and operating as business per usual here. The absence of any real consequence after the verdict prompted massive protests by many Sami people and environmentalists, and especially among the youth, united by their outrage for the state's disregard for indigenous rights and basic humanity, climate change, and environmental destruction. So, after 500 days of governmental inaction, protesters launched a civil disobedience campaign in Oslo, and they occupied entrances to the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Finance, and other government buildings. Let me see here. So here are some images from the press. Spokespersons called out the government for engaging in green colonialism. And when the energy minister eventually showed up to talk to the protesters, they refused to speak to him, and they chose instead to joik, the traditional Sami singing in Sami language, to demonstrate their anger and disapproval. Many Sami protesters wore the traditional garment kofte, the very colorful one you see here, inside out, which is also a sign of anger. They decorated government buildings with Sami flags and even chained themselves to buildings. Here's another photo of the minister being quite in a fluster about what to do about the situation. This led to the prime minister apologizing to the Sami population for breaching their human rights, but nothing happened. So after 100 more days of inaction, protesters again descended on Oslo, blocking entrances to ministries, and also eventually gathering outside the royal palace. Yeah, this is not exactly Buckingham Palace as you have it in the UK, but this is the best we've got. And I think it's a very evocative photo here. So later in the fall of 2023, negotiations brought a compromise. And actually today, this afternoon, there was final compromise agreement made. I was just listening to it 10 minutes before I came on here. But basically the same thing happened today, which is that reindeer herders are given financial compensations and the right to claim other territories for winter grazing purposes. But Sami protesters are not happy about this at all. This is not considered a victory at all. So back to the sort of queer part of this, and I know I only have 2 or 3 minutes left, but I'll try to wrap up here. So whereas the Fosen campaign started out as a collaboration between environmental activists and Sami youth, The adapted slogan was solidarity with our Sami brothers, sisters, and siblings. And this became a clear invitation for all people to get involved and feel part of the campaign. Many grassroots community organizations and groups with a large contingent of queers, and I use this as an umbrella term, were allies on the ground and showed up to support those who protested in front of buildings and on the streets. For example, the local chapter of the gay men's BDSM group, Scandinavian Leathermen, promptly donated chains from their basement playroom for protesters to chain themselves to the building. Local queer music groups and communities showed up with food and drink. They played music for tired protesters in late hours, and they offered company to boost overall morale. The Organization for Queer Immigrants, Queer World, Skeiverden, offered organizational support, and the iconic gay London pub, which was the target of the terrorist attack against Oslo Pride in June 2022, opened their doors for protesters to rest and get a timeout. So the picture that emerges here, to make it very short and excluding the more theoretical points, is an organizational tactics based around strategic interventions from parts of the Sami, climate and queer movement that value and understand the importance of coalitional strength in practice, not so much by engaging in discursive actions and statements outward, including one-off activist protests or speaking on camera to ministers, but by building on a pre-existing commitment to protecting youth and future generations. The seemingly small and spectacular ways that people showed up for the protesters, none of them, apart from the BDSM chains, made media headlines, gesture toward a shared understanding of the need for patience, as well as for structures, resources, and ongoing engagement outside of the frenzy of social media-fueled news cycles, outrage, and drama. It is important, argues Jeff Fung in his brilliant dissertation toward queer climate justice, and I encourage you to read it if you want to hold a contradiction as we struggle against injustice at many levels, even as we do our best in the moment we're in and with the resources we have, and small victories can and must be celebrated. More is possible and necessary. Thank you, and sorry if I went over time.
No, you were absolutely perfect and within time. Thank you very much. That brings us back to full circle to the question of care and policy and the state and the need for solidarity and engagement, the politics of care and for social justice. And thank you for this very sort of vibrant and success that you have contributed to the department. The department is not what it is if it weren't for you then and now. So it really is an honor, and in gratitude, I just want to say thank you. It also brings a lot of comfort to be in such a company. So thank you for that as well.